千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Daodejing by Lao Tzu. As always, I would like to extend a warm welcome to one and all. Thank you for joining us. I would like to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment in time, to the here and now, to be fully present and mindfully aware as we all ready ourselves for this sacred process in the Tao with one another. Previously, we talked about the Chinese title for this chapter. The literal translation of the characters that you see there, 3 characters, is left, contract, and chapter, respectively. So this is the left contract chapter. Now that is the literal translation, but what it means with left contract is the left part of a written loan agreement after it is torn down the middle into 2 halves. The left part goes to the lender, as we discussed in detail last time. So what does the chapter say? Last time, we also did our sectional analysis of chapter 79, and we identified 4 sections. These 4 sections, they are mostly couplets, the poetic construction of 2 lines, and those will be sections 2, 3, and 4. The first section contains 3 lines. And you're going to see sometimes that people will combine line 1 with line 2 to form a longer line, and that's okay too. What we have here in the 3 sections, in the 4 sections, the first section is talking about the great dispute and the remaining animosity even after the great dispute has been settled, has been resolved. Nothing is perfectly 100% resolved. Then, in the second section, we start getting into the left part of the contract. So we're about to get into the second half, starting with line 6, and that goes into combining and tying together the left part of the contract with the idea of having and not having virtue. So we'll talk about all that in great detail. As a recap for our discussion last time, we started out with that first section that talks about how there's always going to be disagreements from time to time. That is what happens in life. So this chapter says, after settling a great dispute, there must be remaining resentments. How can this be considered good? How can this be a good thing? There's always going to be some negativity remaining, regardless of what happens. So as I mentioned last time, we always say, hey, no hard feelings, okay? But that's just an expression. We know from personal experience, it's hardly ever true. There's always going to be a little bit of hard feelings left over from the dispute. And that's because of the nature of life, the nature of the world in general. When something is broken, it can never be perfectly mended, and that includes personal relationships and the trust that might have taken years to build with someone. Once that is broken, it's like a mirror. It's going to be hard to put it back together, and it's not going to be put back together perfectly. So we went into our discussion of the ancient loan agreement. As I mentioned, it's what happened in ancient times when a loan agreement would be split into two halves. The left part, as you can see in this graphic, goes to the lender. The right part goes to the borrower. The two halves have the same information in regards to the loan itself. So that information has to match to prove that the two halves were once upon a time together. The tier is going to be imperfect and uneven down the middle. So when the two halves are rejoined together, they will fit perfectly. And this is how they proved that this was indeed authentic. Now, let me just emphasize one point. Lao Tzu used this as the primary metaphor of this chapter because back in his days, approximately 2,500 years ago, this right here, what you see here, was the prevalent method of documenting loans. It meant everyone was familiar with it. I mentioned previously that Tao sages like to speak in plain, everyday terms. This is to help people understand the abstract concepts they're talking about. When it comes to the Tao, some of the concepts can be pretty abstract, as we have all seen. The loan agreement was a metaphor that Lao Tzu knew everyone at that time would be able to grasp instantly. Oh, I know what that's about. I know what you're getting at. Here in this slide, graphically, that scheme is depicted as a parchment paper torn down the middle. And definitely, certainly, paper was used in this manner once it was invented. But back in the days of Lao Tzu, it hadn't been invented yet. So when he spoke of the loan agreement, it was something that was usually inscribed on bamboo or a piece of wood. Much more likely, a piece of wood. And even before that, in primitive times, it could be a piece of tree bark. So the important point here is that at the time of Lao Tzu, this system of authenticating a loan agreement had already been used for centuries. To them, to the people back then, this was not new or interesting or strange. Today, there's novelty associated with it in our perception only because the system has fallen out of disuse. It's been replaced with modern methods of authentication, no longer torn down the middle. Although I would say that as you look at the seals here, the seal remains a method of identity authentication throughout Asia. So we talked about the scheme of tearing a loan agreement down the middle. Then Lao Tzu further extends on this concept by saying that the sage interacting with people, helping people out, it is as if the sage has lent money to people, except we're talking about spiritual currency, not actual currency. Spiritual currency will be in the form of wisdom, advice, suggestions, solutions about life. Now, the sage is lending out, so to speak, his or her wisdom, but not collecting on this loan of wisdom. As we talked about last time, not collecting is the ancient way for the ancient Chinese to express the same idea that today we talk about as pay it forward. Now, this slide here is depicting what can happen when the sage not only expresses to the wisdom lender that, hey, listen, that wisdom that I gave you, that was not a favor, that was not a loan, it was a gift. You don't have to repay that in the form of another personal favor back to me. Rather than to repay this particular spiritual loan, it would be better for you to understand the idea to pay it forward, which means you can use your experience to help someone else in the same position as yourself who can definitely use a little bit of that wisdom. And please also explain this concept to them. So this will be a lot better because it can have a profound impact on society. So this graphic here is meant to depict the multiplying effect of paying it forward. We have definitely seen examples of that in the modern world, in the Western world, even though many people in the Western world don't really know about the Tao, have not heard about the Tao. It works because it is the best part of human nature. This idea appeals to our highest selves, our conscience. When we hear about it, we know it is a good thing for all of us collectively. And this can become like the ripple effect depicted here. The other important point we talked about last time was that you and I, everybody, we're all connected at a fundamental level of reality, which means everything we do has an effect on other people, like a pond during rainfall. Many ripples, some large, some small, all affecting one another. It becomes pretty complex. Now, very often, because most people nowadays are not aware of the Tao, they may not really have a sense of how this works. And the ripple effects happen no matter what actions we take, but the ripple effect, the ripple itself, may not be big enough to be widely noticeable because it was most likely generated with little or no awareness of Tao teachings. When we ourselves follow the Tao, we do become aware of it, and we can then begin to see better how things actually work in the world. We see how to create a ripple that will have a beneficial impact to many, and one that will have a farther reach, longer lasting duration. So last time we went through a bunch of examples, oftentimes for people who are not even aware of it, but have generated ripple effects that benefited many people continuously. Then this is the place where we ended up last time. We ended at line 5. So line 4 says, therefore the sage holds the left part of the contract, but does not demand payment from the other person. So that is exactly what we just went through. This is going to be the way that we tie the left part of the contract with the beginning of this chapter. Remember, in the beginning, it's talking about disputes and resolution of the disputes with animosity still remaining, left over, residual resentment. It is because of the sages have this accurate perception of this life pattern. They look around, they observe human interactions. They notice that it's always like this. It's always like, hey, no hard feelings, right? But then there are definitely hard feelings. Noticing this pattern leads the sages to the conclusion that it is better to lend, quote unquote, and not collect, quote unquote, to help other people without expecting anything in return, and to make it clear to them that they should pay it forward. So that's what we ended up. Now, let's move on to the lines beyond this point. We are now on line 6. Those who have virtue hold the contract. So those who have virtue, this is a good thing. But let's start with qi, the contract, the last character. And this is a character that's reiterated quite a few times in this chapter. The contract, remember, is a metaphor. It's metaphorical, not actual, because it's not a physical loan document that Lao Tzu is talking about here. The contract here represents a positive interpersonal interaction, like an assistance. To hold the contract means you have helped others, that you have rendered the assistance. Now, that assistance can be a big help. It can be timely help that is very significant and has a big impact on the person being helped. But it can also be the little things in life. Sometimes it's the little things that have the biggest impact. That's how it oftentimes works in the Tao. What little things am I talking about? Well, it could be like giving someone a helpful suggestion. You may not think it's much, but it can mean a whole lot to the person who got a suggestion that he or she otherwise it would not have occurred to them. It can be pointing someone in the right direction when someone is lost, whether physically, or spiritually lost. Pointing someone in the right direction may take relatively little effort, but can make a huge difference to that person. Or just keeping someone company when they really need it. Haven't we all been there? There's been times in life when we know we ourselves really could use some company. And when we sense that in another person, being empathetic, sympathetic, we would naturally want to do what we can. And just by being present, just by being there, that's really something that doesn't take a whole lot of effort and yet can make a huge difference. Now, whether the assistance is big or small, the key is that the assistance without attachment is a virtue. That is, you are doing it not to incur a spiritual debt, but because it's the proper thing to do. It's the good thing to do. It is the right thing to do. So the virtuous in the Tao, someone who is truly virtuous, would hold the contract. And now in the second bullet, you see that it just means helping someone else. In the third bullet, it further means that you're helping without any attachments as in expectations of a reward. So virtue in this context is similar to merit in Buddhism. When you study Buddhism, Buddhism teachings talk a lot about merit. Merit in Buddhism is similar to virtue in the Tao. In Buddhism, to enact, to manifest a merit, it must be done from a compassionate heart that does not have strings attached. In a similar way, in the Tao, when virtue is enacted or manifested, it must be done without the strings attached. Let's move on to the other side of the coin, line 7. Those without virtue hold the collections. So now we see diametrically opposite, like the yin and yang two halves, those who have virtue and those who don't have virtue. And the other complementary duality is contract and collection. So just as the contract is not actual, not physical, the same applies to collection. It is also metaphorical. Now, contract, as you have heard, was metaphorical for a positive interpersonal interaction. The flip side of the coin is that collection represents a negative interpersonal interactions, like a demand or an imposition. Therefore, to hold collection is to make a demand, is to impose, is to make an imposition, make a demand for repayment, a reminder to someone, a pointed reminder to another person, hey, look, you owe me. You owe me one for what I did for you back in the days. Something like that. It's a demand to reciprocate one favor for another. What it means is that the original assistance, hey, remember what I did for you? That assistance, it has strings attached. It carries obligations to the other person that they have to one day repay in kind. So in both the Tao and Buddhism, this kind of assistance with conditions attached is not really virtuous at all. It has no virtue. In Buddhism, it's no merit. It is, as the Bodhidharma once remarked, it is like a shadow. An object will cast a shadow, and the shadow seems like it's real, like it's present, but the shadow has no substance. Now, I talked about how an assistance, a positive interaction with someone else can be big or small. Same thing here. Collection can be a big demand, a harsh demand, but it could also be something relatively minor. For example, it can be wanting recognition and visibility for having helped someone. Like somebody may say, well, look, I don't need any rewards for the good thing that I have done. I just want to be recognized for what I did. Well, what is that? That is a craving of the ego to be visible, to have a higher profile, to be seen. Although it is relatively minor, it is still an attachment, and it qualifies as connection, as collection in terms of the negativity of that personal interaction. Because of that, only those without virtue, or true merit, will make this kind of demand or have this kind of expectation. Demand will be, pay me back. Expectation will be, I should be recognized for what I did. So I think you see the difference between the two. I think it's clear as night and day. Now there's a related concept to this. Here we're talking about having virtue and not having virtue. This is related to a concept from chapter 38, which is about high virtue and low virtue. So here's what it says. High virtue is not virtuous, therefore it has virtue. Low virtue never loses virtue, therefore it has no virtue. So this is the related concept, the difference between high virtue and low virtue. High virtue flows naturally. So there are no conditions, no expectations, no attachments. It's just like when nature provides a goodness to human beings, whether it's air, water, food, some sort of sustenance or shelter from the environment, when it provides a goodness, nature has no expectations, no attachments, imposes no conditions upon us. So, has virtue, in this context, means truly virtuous. Thus, it is the purest form of virtue without pretentious contrivance. The flip side is having no virtue. When one has constant reminders or even rules to be virtuous, it is a sure sign one lacks real virtues. And this is because low virtue is mindful of itself, constantly reminding everyone how virtuous it is. Like saying, listen, look, this is a big deal. This is why people owe me big time. Okay? Therefore, it has no virtue. Now, before we leave this slide, I want to talk a little bit about this virtue, the key concept of virtue. Why such a big emphasis on virtue? Well, first of all, the Daodejing is actually composed of two parts. Daodejing and Dejing, together they form the Daodejing. So this is something that you have heard me talk about multiple times if you've been following these talks for years. However, I know that there are always new people coming into this meeting for the first time who have not heard this before, and also people watching recordings of this who have not encountered this before. So let me take a quick minute to explain. The two parts of the Daodejing first starts with Daojing, which is the Tao classic. It goes from chapter 1 to chapter 37. Then this is followed by Dejing, the virtue classic. It goes from chapter 38 to chapter 81. So ever since chapter 38, we've been talking about virtue as a major topic. Now we of course know that Tao means the path or the way. The term Tao has become common usage by now in the Western world. There are many books, the Tao of this, the Tao of that. Just like there are books about the Zen of motorcycle maintenance, the Zen of this, the Zen of that. So it can be translated directly as Tao, T-A-O, but pronounced with a D sound. So we're okay there. De is not in common usage, so it has to be translated into a different word. I use the word virtue. There are people who use the word power. I'm going to explain why and why that is a suboptimal choice. First of all, virtue, the English word, is coincidentally similar to de in that it's got a double meaning. Virtue in English, just like de, primarily means a human goodness, like being kind, patient, diligent, considerate, helpful, and so on. It does have a secondary meaning, like what we say by virtue of. It's due to the goodness of something. That's what it means. For instance, we might say, oh, by virtue of being at the right place and at the right time, I witnessed the event. It unfolded there, at that place, at that time. So by virtue of being present, I was able to witness it. It was a good thing that I just happened to be there. I just happened to be able to see something happen when it happened. It's not because I was virtuous in the sense of human goodness like compassion. It was by the power of coincidence, being present when something occurred. So in that sense, we can talk about virtue as power or potency by virtue of something, but power or potency in a spiritual sense, not a material sense. And it's like when we say, by virtue of following the correct steps, I was able to complete the task. By the power of following the steps one step at a time, I did it. We can then further extend that to by virtue of following the Tao, the path, I can become a better person in life. So this is why some would say Daodejing is the book of the way and its power. It isn't wrong, but note it is still better to translate De as virtue, so we can capture and preserve the dual meaning of the original. It's just a happy coincidence that both the ancient Chinese and the English utilize the same word in the same way. So let's move on. Speaking of ancient times and modern times, let me just provide some context from ancient times to now, with and without virtue, starting with without virtue. In ancient times, when Lao Tzu talked about this, it was the time of kings, rulers, absolute rulers, monarchs, with tax collectors possibly serving a tyrant. When that was the case, the tax collector will be oppressing the people, taking from them, leaving them barely enough to be able to survive. Now, that's one of the meaning that Lao Tzu was trying to convey when he talked about collections without virtue. It is an oppression of the people to try to take from them what they were already having too little of. The sage, on the other hand, would be the diametrically opposite to that, in the sense that the sages would give to the people, provide them with support, while asking for nothing in return. Whereas the tax collectors were imposing and demanding. That is the difference. So that was ancient times. Let's move from there to modern times. So our world today, think about the people that we have seen in life who contribute nothing or very little that is worthwhile while trying to take as much as possible. So in life, we see the givers and the takers. There's going to be unfortunate situations where you find yourself doing all the giving and no taking at all, and people take advantage of you. And we see that in other people's interactions as well. There are people that we have seen that we know who give more so than they take. These we consider the good people. And conversely, there are the people who take much more than they give. These are the people who take advantage. Now, it is clear to us which kind of people we want to be, we want to emulate. We aim to give more than we take in every aspect of life. We want to group ourselves with the people that we respect and like and admire because they are givers more than they are takers. We have also seen people who seek faults point fingers, like you owe something, like a loan collector hunting down the borrower. Pay back now, making demands. So this is talked about in the Daodejing in a spiritual sense. Therefore, we want to look for faults only within ourselves and not other people. We want to cut people some slack. So this would be the reverse of the people who look for faults only at others while cutting themselves plenty of slack. Haven't we all seen people like that? I know I certainly have. Then, let's talk about yet another example of being without virtue. People who feel entitled to everything while appreciating nothing. So this is all following the same scheme, the same theme that you see down the left-hand side. People who contribute nothing, taking as much as possible. People who feel entitled to everything, appreciating nothing. We want to be the ones with virtue, which means we live in gratitude. We want to be aware at all times to take nothing for granted. This is the way that I choose to live myself. I take nothing for granted. When someone is doing something good, beneficial, I appreciate it all the more. I take it also not for granted. Now, we have now been through these metaphors quite a few times, so it is now time to summarize the different parts of it to bring some clarity into what Lao Tzu had in mind when he talked about the sages holding the left part of the contract. It is certainly not because the sages used to be loan sharks, handing people out high interest loans and then making money in the process. That certainly is not what it meant. It's the play between the material world, which people knew about, people were familiar with physical loan documents, and then using that to talk about the spiritual side of life. That was the gift of the ancient sages, including Lao Tzu, that they could always relate what people knew, what people understood, and extend that to the spiritual dimension to give people a more spiritual understanding of life. So the first category there is exchange. What I mean by that is the exchange, the interplay among people, the exchange of energy, if you will. In the material world, it comes in the form of material assistance or resources, currency, funding, money. And that is why the example is about the loan agreement. It's all about lending and paying back money. That is the material currency. The spiritual currency, on the other hand, for spiritual exchange, would be virtues, wisdom, mastery of life, insight into issues, practical solutions. So the sages were in a position to dispense spiritual currency to people, handing people spiritual money, so to speak, that they could use to pay down a spiritual problem. So what about the people who hold the right part of the loan agreement, not the left part? That's for the sages. In the Daodejing example, the right part in the material world back in those days would be the people who need the money, and so they approach the source of funding to take out a loan. The source of funding in ancient times would be the wealthy people, nobility, etc. Oftentimes, the wealthy could manage to make themselves a minor noble just by befriending and giving benefits to the nobility class. Either way, the poor people who were in need of money would go to them to take out a loan and therefore create that physical loan document split in the middle. In the spiritual context, this is about people holding the right part of the loan will be the people who are in need of advice. And therefore, just like poor people approaching rich people in the material context, in the spiritual context, it is the people who are in need of spiritual help approaching the source of wisdom, often the sages themselves, to request their help, their advice, their suggestions. So you can see the one-to-one correspondence between the two. Then, holding the left part in the material world context is people who had a lot of money and therefore able to lend to people and charge interest. In the spiritual context, this maps to the sages who have an abundance of virtue, meaning the wisdom, the mastery of life, insights into issues, practical solutions. Remember the dual meaning of virtue. It is a human goodness, but also it has the added secondary meaning of spiritual power and spiritual potency. Having that, they're able to provide assistance. They're able to share that spiritual power. Then let's go to the no payback necessary. This will be rare in the material world, where the lender forgives the loan to instead make it a gift, so there's no need to pay it back. That usually never happens. In the spiritual realm, the spiritual side of life, the sages will require themselves to do it all the time, to help people with no strings attached, to ask people to pay it forward instead, as we have seen in the previous slides. Now, the flip side of that will be aggressive collection. That's the flip side of no payback necessary. So in the material context, this will be loan sharks exploiting people in need, pursuing lenders to demand payment. You are delinquent, you are late with your mortgage payment or car payment, your house, your car is about to be repossessed, and so on. In the spiritual dimension, it's people who are the opposite of the sages in that they demand favors. They feel entitled to pay back, thus showing lack of virtue. This is how we map real life examples for Lao Tzu to speak to spiritual issues. Let's continue on to line 8. Line 8 says the Heavenly Tao has no favorites. This is the second from last line of this chapter, so we are nearing the end of this chapter, although there's a huge amount to talk about because the last 2 lines are also the most important in this chapter. Here, one's talking about the Heavenly Tao. The first 2 characters that you see, Tian Dao. These characters refer to the Tao of heaven in Daodejing chapter 77 that we went through not that long ago. In that chapter, it says the Tao of heaven reduces the excessive and adds to the lacking. So first, please note that Tian Dao and Tian Zhi Dao are 2 ways of talking about the same thing. Tian Dao, 2 characters, translated quite literally as the Heavenly Tao. 天之道, the character in the middle, translated as of, but with the order of Tao and heaven reversed in accordance with English grammar. So the Tao of heaven. What it's talking about is that whether you call it the Heavenly Tao or the Tao of heaven, either way, it's a balancing mechanism. It's a metaphorical balancing function that spans all of existence. Everywhere, every when, it spans the physical universe as well as the metaphysical realm. It's all time and space, so past, present, and future. There's a lot more to say about the balancing mechanism coming up. Now, I want to take a step back and say and talk about how the Tao plays no favorites. The Tao is more like natural laws, immutable. It doesn't change. It's like when we talk about how the only constant in existence is change itself. The only constant is that there's always going to be change. That never changes. It's impersonal. It has no personal relationship with you. It's not a deity. It has no emotions. It has no personal favorites. This is in contrast to deities, East or West, past, present, or future, that are highly personal, that are highly emotional. The Tao is a concept like the laws of physics, the laws of nature. No feelings. It just works. Now, the flip side of the Tao not having personal favorites is that the Tao also holds no personal animosity. There's nothing that in the Tao that is against you personally. Now, I want to take a closer look at this because, first of all, there are no personal favorites, that the Tao has no favorites, which is why there's no thanking the Tao, like giving thanks to a deity. I can still be thankful for what happens in life. I can still be grateful and appreciative. Nothing wrong with that. It is not necessary to direct the thanks or appreciation to a particular entity in the Tao. The Tao does not need anyone's appreciation or gratitude, just like nature doesn't need that, although oftentimes we are very appreciative of the wonders of nature. That just makes sense. Now let's talk about the flip side of it. As we go through life, we oftentimes will see people who think in the opposite way of what is represented here in this slide, in the sense that they feel convinced that there's something working against them. For example, you will sometimes hear people look up to the sky. Oh Lord, why me? Or they may turn to you and say, I guess somebody up there likes me, or conversely, I guess somebody up there hates me. This is because they assign emotions, agency to up there, to the heaven, to a deity. In the Tao concepts, this is not the case. The Tao cannot, it does not, or cannot hate even those who are without virtues, just like it does not and cannot love those who are virtuous. The way that it works, though, is that it's, as we mentioned just now, a balancing mechanism. It is also a reflecting mechanism. When I say balancing, it doesn't mean as simplistic as, oh, it balances by giving to people who have more and give it to people who have less. It's not quite that simple. There's a little bit more to it, which we're going to explore. For now, let's just keep in mind that it gives to and takes away from everyone, everybody, without distinction. So the bottom line is that those people that we know, the demanding, entitled people, the people who contribute less or nothing, those without virtues, always making demands, those are the ones with negativity in life. It's due to the impartial functioning of the Tao, not anything personally against them. That's the takeaway here. On the other side of it, there's also people who benefit greatly in life. So that's the reason why we have the two main points. The two main points are reflection and balance. These two main points will answer the question, if the Tao is impartial, why do some people catch all the breaks? We look at the people who seem to have it all, people who seem, quote unquote, lucky. Or sometimes we see that people who follow the Tao correctly, they get better treatment in life. Life becomes nice and smooth for them. Now we can see that, well, it's not because they are favored by the Tao or anyone else. They could be favored by other human beings. Human beings are capable of emotions and playing favorites. But the Tao is not human. The Tao has no favorites. The two main points, reflection and balance. First, reflection. The Tao gives to them because they give to others. Life is reflective in that sense. Your life becomes like the person you are rather than what you wish you would like to receive. So when you become a genuinely better person, you begin to experience a genuinely better life. The same is true the other way too. When you turn back from the Tao, when you stray away from the Tao, when you are actually not as good a person as you were before, if you go in the other direction, you will begin to experience a life that is, shall we say, not better. The same basic reflective characteristic of reality is the reason why people who only visualize something they want and not take any actions toward that thing, more often than not, they end up not getting what they wish for. It's because reality has reflected on them accurately, like a karmic mirror. Therefore, because they have not taken any action, reality has also not taken the action to manifest what they wish for into actual material reality. Reality is just like the people that live their lives in that way. So the only choice they have is to utilize selective memory to convince themselves that visualization really works. That is, they remember the few times that it worked and forget conveniently the rest of the time when it did not work. They don't realize that the few times when they did get something, they had taken some action, whether they realized it or not. Second point is balance. So the Heavenly Tao is a metaphysical mechanism for balance. Karma sees to it that everything balances out in the long run. So those with virtue, generosity of heart, providing assistance without attachments, end up with a positive life. And they end up with that good life even if they don't pray. So prayer is not the focus of the Tao. One particular sage taught this idea in a specific way. He said that imagine what happens when you are sick and there's a doctor who's prescribing medicine for you to take and also is telling you that you need to change your life habits. You need to eat better, avoid certain foods that are not good for you, you need to exercise, etc. The doctor has provided you with a way out of your predicament, which is the sickness. So for the sick, it doesn't do them any good to keep calling out the doctor's name and to ask the doctor to do something to help them when the doctor has already provided the medicine and the lifestyle advice to how to change the way they approach life. It will do them a lot of good if they take those steps. It will do them much more good for them to take the path that the doctor has pointed out. It's the same thing in the Tao. Instead of praying to a deity for protection, it is much better to follow the prescription of the Tao, to live your life in the way that is prescribed, to take measures, to do things that will actually resolve the issue. Calling out the doctor's name won't do anything. The doctor will simply repeat the instructions for you to follow. That is the Tao. So, bottom line, those who practice the Tao of giving will also receive abundantly. Seems like a simple statement, but now you can see this. You can see the balance. You can see the reflection in that statement. And the balancing mechanism works in metaphysical ways. What that means is that what they get back seems to be from a source that is completely disconnected from what they gave to. The source of the good fortune seem completely unconnected. So someone who is doing charitable work out of the goodness of their hearts will receive goodness, abundance from different sources, not connected to people who have received the charity. This is always the way it works. And so when the sages do something, expecting nothing in return, they nevertheless know that by doing something good, the reflecting mechanism will bring something good back by itself from a different source. They know this, like farmers know about sowing and reaping. And this answers what is supposed to be a paradox, but really isn't a paradox. The people who say that, well, if the sages know about the reflecting and balancing nature of the Tao, and they do something good because of it, wouldn't that short circuit the process because they have expectations? Well, it isn't the same expectation like, I've done something good for you, now you've got to scratch my back in return. That's the left part, right part, demanding payments, collections. That's what this chapter is all about. What the sages know is that the way the natural laws work, like plants growing, farmers know when they sow seeds that they can expect harvest. Sowing and reaping cannot be precisely predicted, but they know what is going to happen because the farmers are working in alignment with nature. That's the key. The sages live in alignment with the Tao, and if we can bring ourselves into alignment with the Tao, it works for us as well. You and I can reap the rewards in the same way. So this is why I say it is so important to get into alignment with the giving and beneficial aspect of the Tao. When you have that genuine alignment, you begin to genuinely receive abundance in life. And that abundance, it is as abundance as the nature of nature itself. Let me say that again. The abundance of abundance is exactly as the nature of nature itself. That is the Tao. There may be temporary fluctuations up and down. That's life too. In the long run, though, everything works out. So what we're saying here is that, well, it works because at a fundamental level, we're all connected. And this is basically a description of karma in the original Tao. 2,500 years ago, they didn't know anything. They didn't have a term for karma, but they understood what it meant. They understood how it worked. Now, let me emphasize the insights from the sages and their teachings. They emphasize this point. The Heavenly Tao has no favorites. Here I have an image that depicts the falling rain. The rain is falling on flowers and weeds alike. It doesn't make a difference to rain what is receiving the goodness of the rain. In a similar way, the Tao encompasses all beings the same way. It applies to me as well as it applies to you. It's the ultimate form of egalitarianism. There's no distinction between near, close, kind, cruel, etc. The Tao works the same way for all. And there are no special favors or granting miracles in the Tao. And I just want to point this out because this is so different from what we typically see in life. When people find themselves praying in times of adversity, they are oftentimes praying to a particular deity and asking for special favors, asking for a miracle to manifest. In the Tao, it's not quite that way. In the Tao, Tao cultivators focus on alignment rather than prayers. I think you can see why. Tao cultivators see prayers as a way to focus the mind on something. It's a method. It's a methodology for focus. And focus brings about greater power. Now, sages would also point out the original purpose of religions was about alignment with the dogma, the rules, the teachings, the praying, the rituals. Every religion of the world started out as a way to bring human beings into alignment with the divine. Now, one would argue that sometimes they succeed in spectacular fashion, but not always. I think it's very advantageous for us to see the underlying reality behind all that to see how things actually work. That way, you can go in a straight line to what it is supposed to provide, the alignment with the divine. You don't need all the trappings that we see. You can just go straight to the source, the Tao. Another insight from the sages is about virtue. Virtue is the key. De is the ultimate standard of existence. It spans heaven and humanity. Cultivators who understand this will not hesitate to practice virtues as much as possible. As soon as possible, as much as possible. They realize that by doing so, we have the ability to shape our own fate. Fate is not something that should be passively accepted. There's actually a lot that we can do about it. This was the one insight from a particular master who was also adept with Jing fortune telling. So he would convey to everyone that his predictions, fortune telling predictions based on the Jing, would be very accurate, but not accurate at all for people who genuinely practice the Tao. This was because people who did not know the Tao had no choice but to go with fate. At most, what he could do for them was to give them some pointers on some negativity to avoid, or some ways of remediation or mitigation. He said that the ultimate way, though, is not to follow the advice of a fortune teller, but to create and shape your own destiny. The Tao is the way to let you do that. So there's no passive acceptance of fate or destiny in the Tao. There's active shaping of the same thing. That is the reason why we have to examine our own actions, review what we have done. We have to think about, reflect on whether or not my actions will further virtue, accumulate merit, depending on whether you are leaning more toward the Tao or Buddhist teachings. With the Tao, virtues. With Buddhist teachings, merit. Ultimately, same thing. This means we can utilize the key. We can unlock the master control panel for destiny through conscience. And by that, I mean conscientious choices that we make in the actions that we take. This makes a world of sense to me from the sage, and I hope it makes sense to you. So now let me talk about the sage. This chapter talks quite a bit about the sages holding the left part of the contract. To hold the left part is to take actions without attachments. The same realization is available from all the great sources of wisdom of the world and human history. The example that I'm going to cite is from Buddhism, specifically Zen Buddhism. The graphic that I have here is a combination of the yin and yang symbol and the Buddha. Ultimately, they are one and the same. In the Zen Buddhist tradition, the sixth patriarch, Huineng, when he received the wisdom of the Diamond Sutra from the fifth patriarch, he became enlightened. He became awakened. He was ecstatic. It opened his eyes, literally, and he expressed his enlightenment as follows. 一切万法 all the 10,000 dharmas, 不离自性, are not apart from self-nature. Here you see the literal translation. All the 10,000 dharmas are not apart from self-nature. What it means is that none of the myriad dharmas of the world is separate from the nature of the self. Dharma is a specific term in Buddhism. It can mean dharmic teachings, or it can mean a worldly manifestation. It can be a method, or it can be anything. All things are manifestations of dharmas in the world. Self-nature is who you truly are. This is your true self. This, we're talking about your soul. So when we act from the compassion of the Buddha, there are no attachments because those actions are coming from self-nature, the true self, the highest self, the soul. Actions that are driven, powered by the soul. This is Wu Wei, the virtue of holding the left part of the contract. The term Wu Wei itself means actions taken without attachments. It doesn't mean non-action in the sense of passivity, of doing nothing. It means unattached action. There's a difference. Finally, let's address the balancing Tao. And this is because the Heavenly Tao, as I mentioned, is just exactly the same term as the Tao of Heaven, depicted as a balancing mechanism. Here I have the yin and yang symbol. Yin is on the right-hand side. Yang is on the left-hand side. There's the dot of yin within yang. There's a dot of yang within yin. So first, let me bring up the conventional concept. This is like yin and yang 101. This is the most basic level where people will look at yang as representing light, increase, gain. The sun, for instance, daytime. And then yin represents decrease and therefore loss. It represents nighttime. Now, the Tao sages have a more sophisticated understanding of the yin and yang symbol. There's a specific way of using the symbol to gain insights into what happens to us in life. What would it mean to have balance between increase and decrease, gain and loss? Does it mean that everything balances to zero? No, that's not what it means. Let me explain what it actually means. For many people who study the Tao, this is what you're looking at here in this slide, is the point where they reach and go no further in their contemplation. This right here, I would actually say it doesn't provide a whole lot of in-depth wisdom about life. There's no revelation that turns on the light bulb to make you say, aha, I just got another piece of wisdom. Tao sages look at it in a different way. They look at it this way. They'll say, yang represents that which is external, overt, visible, readily seen, like the material world, like the external manifestations, the surface appearance that we can readily perceive. That's yang, the obvious, the overt. Conversely, they will point to yin and say, no, it doesn't mean like darkness, evil, bad things. Look, Tao sages will say, yin represents that which is internal, covert, invisible, unseen, the spiritual dimension. There's nothing dark, sinister, bad about that. It's yin and yang. So what is the significant insights? There's visible gain versus unseen loss. So visible gain, 赢得, is on the yang side. The unseen loss, 暗损, is on the yin side. What does that mean? This is from what we observe in life. The sages themselves have observed that so often we see the visible gains of people who perhaps are healthy, are famous, popular, powerful, successful. We see that very easily because it is the surface appearance. But there is another side, what we don't see. Oftentimes, not always, but often, there's a hidden side where the people who are wealthy, famous, popular, powerful, successful, etc., have problems that are not readily visible to the world. What kind of problems? Well, perhaps the strain, the demands of wealth, the devotion to business, maintaining fame, or perhaps holding on to power. We don't know what toll it has taken on personal relationships. We have seen or heard of, definitely, cases where wealthy people, rich, powerful people end up with breakup of relationships, of perhaps spouse. We have seen estrangement within family. People not getting along within the family despite the outward external appearance of success. There's also examples that we have seen and heard about where the strain of that outer wealth, popularity, and power has exacted a toll in terms of health, in terms of well-being. Therefore, you see the balancing mechanism there. What is gained in the visible way is taken as a loss in the way that is not so visible. It's the same the other way. There's visible loss of the people who follow the path of giving in accordance to the Tao. That is, they're expending time and effort. It seems like a loss to them. They have no expectations of payback. So they started out with this amount. They gave it away. They're not expecting anything in return. So they have less than before. They are not using the left parts of the contract to collect from the borrower. So that's what people can see. What people don't see as easily is that to the people who are in that position, they are gaining in ways that are not readily visible. They have this sense of joy. Why? Because the work is its own reward. They have greater harmony in life, but that is not so obvious to someone looking in from the outside. They enjoy karma that is positive, that returns to them multiplied many times. I can provide a personal testimonial to this. I know that there are people who are a little surprised that I've been doing this talk for years now. They see me spending a lot of time and effort preparing these presentations for you. They would ask, why do you do that? Why don't you just relax and enjoy the weekend like a normal person? Well, that's the visible loss in terms of time and effort. I'm here to tell you that I have experienced the unseen gains. Why? Because I learn from all of you. This is a privilege. You and I study the Tao together. Together, we channel the great wisdom of the masters. And I have benefited immeasurably, tremendously. Those benefits have impacted every aspect of my life, tangible and intangible, material and spiritual. The gaining of that is something that I treasure. So I can tell you this works. This is the balancing mechanism of the Tao. It's real. And it's operating all the time. If you decide to do the same thing, to give in accordance with the Tao, you are also, like me, going to gain massively. Now, what are the ways that you can give to benefit by understanding how the Tao works? How do you get into alignment with the Tao? In an authentic Tao tradition, they talk about 3 different ways. And they are a very good guideline on how to do it. The most obvious way that majority of people know about is the giving of material contributions, charitable donations, especially to those in need. Now, the visible loss is apparent to most people because you have given monetary or financial resources. It seems pretty obvious to everybody that you now have less than before. It seems to make sense from that material perspective. The unseen gain, you gain material prosperity. It's a balance. Opportunities arise. Opportunities come from unexpected sources, unexpected directions. Investments soar in value. It works. The second way to give is the giving of Dharmic wisdom. As I mentioned, Dharma can represent Buddhist teachings, teachings of wisdom, how to live life. So Dharmic wisdom is about that. Encouraging words, Tao-centric advice at the personal or group level. So there are people who prepare material, as I do, to speak for a group, as we are, and they can benefit from this. But I'm also here to say that it doesn't have to be a group setting. It can be one-on-one. It can be you with someone else, with a friend, that you are providing them with advice or guidance or pointing them in the right direction. Either way, you have expended valuable time and effort to share the Tao. You have provided some kind of guidance, some kind of motivation, hopefully, or support. So that is what you give. Because of the time and effort associated, you seem to have less. You don't have as much time for the quote unquote fun activities of life, to enjoy life. But let's talk about what you gain. As I mentioned in the previous slide, I have personal experience with this. You gain wisdom and insights. You benefit from the Dharmic wisdom even more than the people you shared with. Very true. I can testify to that. Lastly, let's talk about the giving of assistance that is courageous and proactive, like volunteering to take action, extend a helping hand. This could be anything. This is basically helping to do something rather than to give teachings or advice. Again, it's about time and effort. You have expended valuable time and effort to provide assistance without any expectation of recognition. What happens though, Tao masters have observed this time and time again, is that you gain great health, vitality, and this inner joy. It's true. You live a satisfying life that is full of meaningful activities. No wonder your health is great. You're always in a good mood. So this is something that is a pattern Tao masters have observed over centuries. It can manifest as generosity or manifest as Dharma, sharing the Tao with other people, or to give of your own effort and time to help in so many different ways. The benefits are there and they are guaranteed. Why are they guaranteed? Because the Heavenly Tao has no favorites. It constantly gives to the kind people. Now that we have gone through this in great detail and depth, you can see the balancing Tao in action behind the scenes. This should give you all the reasons you need to follow this path. Truly a path of greatness. We are now just past the top of the hour. We should now move on to the summary of this chapter. Last time, we did part 1 of the 2-part summary. And remember, part 1 was about, number 1, beware of the negativity from disputes. This is from the very beginning of the chapter. It basically points out that no matter how you resolve a bad situation, there's going to be some negativity remaining. Therefore, the best possible solution is to anticipate and prevent. If it does happen, as it often will in time, in life, then what we have to do is to accept the reality of the situation. Number 2, we should emulate the way of the sages. Sages themselves note that nature expects nothing for all that it has given to us. Nature has given us everything, expecting nothing in return. That is the way that we should also help people. And we have to have the same clarity in rendering assistance. We have to practice the Tao of giving and helping. And most importantly, to have the pay it forward effect generate and magnify in terms of its magnitude, we have to share the Tao in the process to make it happen. Now, let's go to part 2. We have just completed our discussion line by line of 79, so we should now look into the insights that it has given to us. First, it is virtuous to assist without expectations. True virtue flows naturally, comes with no attachments. So we have now talked about this in a variety of different ways, including from chapter 38. Number 2, there are plenty of examples to the contrary. That is, there are many examples of people who are not virtuous, have no real virtue. We observe the world and know that it is often not Tao-like. It just means we have the opportunity to be different. We have the opportunity to set a better example for the rest of the world that doesn't know about the Tao. Number 3, the Tao is impartial. as it reflects your energy back to you. Nature, just like life and fate, is kind to those who are naturally kind. Nature is kind to those who are naturally kind. And I find it remarkable that language for us supports this kind of expression. It's just another indication that you and I are on the right track. Number 4, and lastly, the virtuous are the good people who receive goodness. Same thing here. Good people receive goodness. This is how positive karma can be a powerful force in our lives. And when I'm talking about positive karma, by now you know I'm talking about holding the left part of the contract. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us all travel safely so we can meet again. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.